I will be your moderator today. My name is Muchimba, coming to you from Lusaka, Zambia. So just as a way to begin our session, of course, this webinar will be recorded and interpretation is available in 3 languages, that is English, Spanish, and French. And as a matter of background, the Debt Wednesday is a course that really is meant to help each and every one of us understand more about the debt situation happening around the world and how it is manifesting itself in different forms. So certainly we would like to acknowledge the support for this event coming from a few donors, just by way of mentioning from the European Union, Bread for World, the Open Society Foundation, and Avena Americas. We'll also have a number of presentations today from partners working in the debt and development networks. And also just to mention, these networks include LatinDad, Eurodad, from the African region, Afrodad. We also have Jubilee USA and APMDD, which is the Asian Development Network. So we will have 2 presentations today, or rather 2 sessions. And really today we are looking at debt relief and the Paris Club historic perspective. We will also have an overview of debt from the African perspective. That is in terms of the structure of our interview. Time will be available for questions and answers, and these can be shared right in the chat. We will have plenary sessions where participants will be allowed to ask any questions that they have. So just to move on and get started, our first presentation will be coming from Remi. And Remi is representing the Committee for the Abolition of Illegitimate Debt. And this is CADTM. Remi, if you are ready, you have the floor and you're free to go ahead and begin your presentation.
Bonjour, merci Muchimba et bonjour à tout le monde. Donc je vais présenter rapidement le Club de Paris et son fonctionnement. Donc je vais partager mon écran pour que vous puissiez voir cela.
So you can see it.
Voilà. Donc comme je n'ai que
Okay. So since I just have 15 minutes, I'm going to go briefly on some aspects, but we can go back afterwards during the discussion and the exchanges. So the Paris Club was created in 1956. There's 65 years ago. And it was created by coincidence, let's say. At that time, Argentina was in need of a restructuring by its bilateral creditors, and those creditors gathered and restructured part of the Argentinian debt. And that's how the Paris Club was born. And since then, it's been consolidated. I will go back to some aspects a bit in details afterwards. So obviously, we're not talking about a football club. The Paris Club is an informal organization of states that ensures the recovery of official claims and to ensure the restructuring of debt from some indebted countries. And when I say debt restructuring, it means that we take all of part of or all of the debt of a country and we restructure it. That means that we decide to extend its repayment by modifying the conditions, or it can be the length of the repayment or the interest rates, etc. So that's what we mean when we say debt restructuring. So the Paris Club has no legal existence, has no charter or no legal personality, it presents itself as a non-institution. So to this end, it looks like to the G7 or G20, it's a regulatory space that is not based on legal claims. The Paris Club defends its operation as a means of achieving rapid and effective restructuring. If you don't know the Paris Club, it's quite common because it's not very famously known. It is mainly known for the heavily indebted poor countries initiative that was held in '67. So what's his role? I partly answered to that question, but when a country is in debt and cannot pay the debt anymore, it can ask to the states, to the creditors, meaning the Paris Club members, a repayment of its debt. And then the Paris Club decides, after several discussions, to cancel or restructure all or part of the claims. This is the list of all the Paris Club members. There's 22 members, and more members join the Paris Club since its creation. I think they started with 6 or 7 members in 56. And since then, many states joined the Paris Club or asked the Paris Club to join. So those countries are important creditors or have become important creditors. So it's the interest of the Paris Club to make them join in order to operate restructuring debt. And as you can see, the G7 members and also the G20 members are quite represented, quite widely represented in the Paris Club. There's also other key players who play a more or less important role in the Paris Club. So when we talk about restructuring a debt, all of the states involved are invited, but we also invite other states, other countries that are not members of the Paris Club. So you can see here on the right side of the chart, when those countries are not members of the Paris Club, they just have an observer status. And this means that they are not going to be taking the decision. They are here to give a series of information about the claims. There's also many international institutions represented in the Paris Club, and it depends on the country and on the type of debts and the types of creditors. So it could be the IMF, the World Bank, the European Development Bank. It could be the OECD, UNCTAD from the United Nations. And all these representatives have an observatory status, but it's a bit of a messy status because in reality, all the observers don't have the same role, and especially they don't have the same decision power. So you can see in bold here the IMF, because the IMF is clearly not an observer like any other, because they participate directly into the negotiations with the creditors, and it has a voice. His voice is being heard compared to other organizations according about the debt restructuring. So as I said, the Paris Club is not based on any legal status, but it does has rules of operations that are guided through 6 principles. The first principle is the conditionality. That means that the Paris Club is subject to one agreement concluded with the IMF previously to any Paris Club agreement. The second principle, the consensus. Paris Club decisions cannot be taken without the consensus among the participated creditor countries. It can be interpreted as a veto power. The third principle is the information sharing principle, meaning that all the members of the Paris Club commit themselves to share all of the information known about a debtor country. The fourth principle is the case by case, meaning that all of the decisions taken will be taken on a case by case basis. The fifth principle is the solidarity principle, meaning that the Paris Club members and creditors have to act on a solidarity basis. That means that one member cannot take a different decision from the rest of the Paris Club members. And last one, the comparability of treatment principle. Once the Paris Club decides on a debt restructuring, the Paris Club seeks to unilaterally impose the terms of the agreement on public or private creditors. So the indebted country has to try and impose again the terms on the other creditors. Here you can see the course of negotiation at the Paris Club. There are 5 different phases. There's 2 preparatory phases, 1 phase of negotiation, and finally 2 phases of decision application. During the first phase, any restructuring debt decision is subjected to an agreement concluded with the IMF and should be made by the country debtor, and the debtor country must also draw up a memorandum detailing its economic and financial situation. And the second phase is about a series of discussions in order to prepare for the third stage, where the debtor country is invited into the Paris Club during the plenary session. And in this plenary session, negotiations between creditors and adoption of a common position are being held. And during, depending on the decisions taken during the plenary session, a decision will be applied about the debt restructuring, and the conditions will be decided on. So there is 2 things happening in terms of renegotiation. There's a theoretic framework. If we look at the functioning of the Paris Club, it's presented as a negotiation session where the debtor countries have the possibility to renegotiate their debt towards the Paris Club members. But in reality, it is more a situation of one debtor country facing many different creditors, and these debtors countries have to face IMF or other international organizations that are the judges of a situation. Finally, we noticed that in the Paris Club functioning, The only international organization which acts as an observer is the UNCTAD, which presents the situation from a development perspective.
Alors, donc en fait, là, ce que vous avez sous les yeux,
here you can see the different terms that can be applied from the Paris Club. It could be the classic terms, Houston terms, Naples, Colonia, Vian, etc. And there's also the HIPC initiative, even if it's not used anymore. And we also have the DSSI initiative, which is the suspension of debt service initiative, which was created last year. The idea is to restructure a part or all of the debt
Et par contre, pour la partie qui est de l'aide publique au développement, le Club de Paris n'opère
and the Paris Club
une restructuration dans le sens où il va étendre
apply a restructuring on non-concessional debt terms, sorry, by extending the repayment period. On the chart, you can see what part of the debt we are talking about. You can see the internal debt on the left and the external debt on the right. You see that the external debt is being divided into different categories, and the Paris Club only restructures the bilateral debt of the external debt. It doesn't restructure the multilateral debt, and it doesn't intervene in the restructuring of the commercial debt either. And some creditors are not Paris Club members, and they are not part of this restructuring. We will talk about this later. We'll talk about China. So the main criticisms on the Paris Club, the first one is that it doesn't have any legitimacy. As I said, it was created out of a coincidence, and it was not the fruit of this decision or an international consensus. Then the second criticism, during the debt crisis of the 80s, namely with Mexico at the beginning, the Paris Club had a very important role, but the decisions taken at that time didn't allow the indebted countries to get out of this situation. As I said, the IMF has a very central power, and this is being so since the 80s. Then about the sixth principle, we can consider that the Paris Club acts as a cartel of creditors that are judges and parties at the same time. About the consensus principle, the countries have the veto power, so we should consider the debt as from a politic perspective, not only an economic one. So it's important to bear this in mind. About the information sharing, the main criticism we can make is that it's a very it's a club that lacks transparency. It is very confidential, so it's almost impossible to get informations about ongoing negotiations and deliberations. The case-by-case decision is also being very criticized because some decisions are taking on a geopolitical nature, and there has been a preferential treatment for some countries like Poland, Egypt, Pakistan, Nigeria, etc. And we can go back to the after that we have the conditionality principle. We already talked about that. And finally, the comparability of treatment is a principle that does not work. And unfortunately, we observed that no country participated in the ISSD initiative. If we take into account the debt sustainability, we should take into account economic and political aspects, but the Paris Club doesn't take into account the political aspects, doesn't take the nature of the debt into consideration either, and whether the decisions will benefit to the population or not. I will stop my presentation here.
Thank you so much, Remi. For anyone that just joined us, we were listening to Remi from the Committee for the Abolition of Illegitimate Debt. And this is our first session of our third Debt Wednesday, looking at debt relief and the Paris Club historic perspective. So at this point in time, we will go into our second presentation. This presentation will be made by Jaime. Jaime is the Global Debt Policy Lead at Oxfam International. Jaime, you can, you have the floor, you can make your presentation.
Thank you very much, Muchimba, and hi, everybody.
Jaime,
Yep.
Okay, great.
Hello, hello. Can you hear me? I guess you cannot hear
Jaime,
me.
we can get you.
Okay, good. I was going to say just a quick thanks for the invite and for the opportunity of talking with all of you people. It's a great chance of exchanging, and I'm very happy to be part of this project. I want to congratulate my colleagues from Afrodad. Not only they are doing a great analytic and political work in this recent period, but they are also putting in place some innovative initiatives, and I really think this training, these sessions is one of those. So now over to my content. After listening to Rémi, what you all already understand, it was what kind of an animal is the Paris Club. So what I'm going to do is try to just follow like 6 different points of issues related to what has to do with the Paris Club, how it operates, what has happened in the past, and some of the challenges we are seeing today that differ from the past. So that's going to be my presentation. 6 quite simple points, I hope, and then I'm happy to engage into any dialogue or any doubts. I think the first point is that the Paris Club is essentially a political body, and it's a political initiative. Rémi told us about the history, the principles, and the whole issue of the Paris Club is trying to guarantee as much debt recovery and as much debt repayments as can be possible for all creditors, all bilateral creditors. And it's also about these creditors holding the whole system in their hands. That was the idea, the original idea. It's a body that has really a strong value if we look back at the history of debt, because we've seen lots of decisions that have passed through them, through the Paris Club. It has been a rule-setting body because they have been the ones that have established what is acceptable and what not, and what is going to happen when a country is in trouble. So we can like it or dislike it, but that's where some of the most important decisions around debt relief have been taken. You have the main creditors of the Western world. That's the kind of we could say the group of the old group of powerful guys in the financial world are the ones sitting in the Paris Club. So that's them. It's a very orthodox club. It's composed by finance ministries and central bankers. So it's both bodies from each of the countries that are members that look at the topics, decide on the issues, and finally make decisions. So it's primarily a financial orthodox body that is very linked to the assessments of the IMF. That said, as I was starting to say, it's a very political body, and I will give some examples that, again, Remi has already started to move. There used to be a strong connection from this Paris Club with the private sector. So in the old days, when private debts were a very small part of developing countries' debts, or of the poorest developing countries' debts, there was an agreement that was called something like a gentleman's agreement between the Paris Club and another body, another club that has no legal existence, that was called the London Club. And the London Club was the club where the main banks of the Western world would sit together and look again at debt matters. And there was this gentleman's agreement where they would apply a comparable treatment or a similar treatment to developing countries that were requesting some sort of debt relief. It used to work, but the truth is that it would affect very small amounts of debts that were mainly tail ends of the bulk of the debts that were mainly government debts. So that was how it worked, but in fact it was there. And I think the last point of this first item I wanted to bring here is that the Paris Club, Remi said, it's really a non-club, a non-institution. Well, it's really part of a non-system of sovereign debt management. I'm sure you've already seen interesting presentations already, and you'll see more, but we lack a system to manage sovereign debts and, of course, sovereign debt restructuring. So that's the first point. The Paris Club is a political body, and that was a political initiative with a strong financial approach and a strong Western and very tightly dominated by Western powers. My second point, of course, is that there are exceptions, and the Paris Club has made a wide number of exceptions throughout the years. Remi was listing some of them. I will give you just two examples. I think it's good to take these examples and understand them, because what they tell us is that when it's been needed and when it's been understood by the international community that debt had to be used as a political tool to provide support for countries, it was used. And I'm going to give you two examples. Egypt in 1991 received a debt relief that was approved by the Paris Club and endorsed by their countries, because it had been a friend to the Western coalition that was supporting the retaliation against Iraq during the first Iraq war. So Egypt got a prize and was rewarded with debt relief measures proposed then by the United States. And that was 1991. Well, in 2004, and there's a nice note, by the way, by the CADTM, where Remi is working, that explains this operation quite well. There was something similar happening to the Iraq government. After the invasion of Iraq, after the second war of Iraq, there was this measure of debt relief to provide with some sort of political support to the newly so-called liberated country after that war. So there was a reward for being part of these operations. And again, the Paris Club endorsed what was proposed. I don't say there was no discussion, but there was an endorsement, and every Paris Club member decided to come in support of what was a political operation. So I just say this because then we can understand that when needed, these very tight financial, strictly kind of overseen rules can be changed and can be really left to the side. And sometimes when we are in face and we are in front of very extreme situations, as civil society actors or as academics or as experts, we will be calling for extraordinary measures on debt relief. And the first response we will get from different bodies, including the Paris Club members, and others would be, no, that's not possible because that will spoil any kind of future capacity of countries to take in new debt or to get support. The reality is that throughout history, we've seen different examples of countries receiving support through debt relief. So this can be done, this has been done, and this can be done again. That was my second point. My third point is about the rules. And again, I'm going to lean on Remi's presentation. He already said what the main rules are. And I think when you talked with Paris Club officials, so with finance ministries officials from different countries, they will tell you, of course, we take into account what the numbers of the countries are, what their willingness to pay is, what their track record of being serious in managing their debt matters, their financial matters, their public administration. All that is being taken into account before deciding what treatment they will be granted. And that's part of the picture. So that's what they will be normally looking at, and that was what will trigger the decision afterwards. As was mentioned too, the Paris Club has a menu of options. This menu of options tells you, depending, or gives you a certain number of thresholds where, depending on the income level of the country, the poverty levels of the country, the debt ratios of the country, and the situation, the actual situation of their debt sustainability, they will be, let's say this way, awarded with a certain treatment of debt relief. That could be a suspension, a postponement, or some actual debt cancellation throughout the years. Interestingly, the terms of the Paris Club, which have been already mentioned, and I could go through each of them, but I think it's not interesting. I have a slide with that for all of you in case you want to take a look at that. But what's interesting in that is that the terms of the Paris Club that will change and will be, of course, will provide more relief the poorest the country is and the tougher the financial situation can be, have historically been agreed through the G7 meetings, and that's my fourth point. So until 2010, there was a system to look at debt and debt relief that was based on 3 pillars. Those 3 pillars were the Paris Club, with this Western membership I'm talking about. The second pillar was the G7, where you had the richest countries in the world that were also members of the Paris Club, and the G7 would move forward with political decisions. They were talking about the HIPC initiative, and they were making decisions about the HIPC initiative, and they were proposing new terms of debt relief, so increasing the amount of relief, sometimes marginally, but that was the case. And then the Paris Club would name its own terms with the city where the meeting of the G7 happened. So large and so profound was the influence of the G7 on what the Paris Club would do, that they will name the terms as the Naples terms, after the G7 Naples, after the Cologne terms, after the Vian terms, etc., etc. So you have this interconnection of the Paris Club and the G7. And the third pillar of this whole decision-making body around debt relief was the IMF, because the Paris Club would rely on the IMF's assessment and the existence of a program with the IMF. And of course, the G7 governments would hold the majority of the voting power in the IMF. And in fact, the G7 members were also the most powerful members of the Paris Club. So in the end, it was a very small group of countries that would be making the decisions and setting the system. We could say this was a rigged system for debt management and for debt relief that worked, that was operational, that provided some decisions, including throughout HIPC, and we could do a long session about that. But this was it. It was a three pieces were kind of connected, interconnected, interrelated, and deciding. So that's my fourth point, and I have 2 more to go. My fifth point is what happened after HIPC, and when we get into the 2010, and what we've been talking about, this new crisis that initially it's been framed as an African crisis, but as things move forward, we are seeing how it's showing to be a more profound and a deeper crisis. And I have here to recommend you to read the most recent paper by our colleague Daniel Munevar, really great paper released this month of March, 1 month ago, where he makes a very good assessment on where things are standing in terms of the troubles with debt in different regions and for different sets of countries. Worth a read. There's not enough time here, and I'm trying to focus on the Paris Club, but I think that's a very good way of understanding where we are standing today. As I was saying, in this time after HIPIC initiative and with this new period, what we have come to see is that, well, Paris Club countries, so the main Western countries, started being very restrictive in the kind of instruments they were using with the least developed countries or with low-income countries and some other developing countries. When you talk to officials, again, in finance ministries, they don't forget that the treasuries of their countries were contributing with money to provide the debt relief that the IMF and the World Bank granted through the HIPIC initiative. So they kind of say, okay, we made this decision, it was debt relief, so we were taking a hit in our treasury, but then there was a second hit, and it was that we've been contributing for the last 10, 15 years to the IMF and World Bank related mechanisms to provide debt relief. So we've restricted our use of loans for developing countries, and now we are a much smaller player in this field. What has happened in this decade is that as the Paris Club members were shrinking their relevance as loan makers and as creditors, we saw others expanding. It's pretty obvious for everyone that the main creditor today is China, and but it's not the only large southern creditor. Thanks to the DSSI database, that's been a great thing that we've all of us people that are looking and interested in debt matters have now in our hands. We can see which are the other large bilateral creditors, and we can see that in the top 10 of the list, it's not mainly China plus the Westerns, but mainly you have China, you have India, you have some of the Gulf states. So we now have this different balance than we used to have in the past. But most of these countries are not members of the Paris Club. So the Paris Club today really holds a very small part of global debt, and this changes the rules of the game. The thing is, the Paris Club still wants to be the negotiating table of debt relief and the place where agreements are settled. And fair enough, because it's the one place that, despite being non-institutional and dominated by the Westerners, at least it has some rules, and you know how things happen. But definitely what you can see there is that, well, this old club that is increasingly or decreasingly relevant in financial terms still wants to hold the power of how debt relief is negotiated, how agreements are taken. So that's the situation today. And if we look at the at the most recent, when we had this COVID shock and we had this debt suspension initiative that has already been mentioned, what immediately happened is that, well, the Paris Club had been trying to attract China and others to sit at their table. So it's a bit of a strange thing, because they were inviting a member that had more than twice as large as the rest of the table, but they were trying to have these members join that same club and constitute that as the place where decisions should be made. Of course, no mention of having debtor countries as proper members, or debtor countries as what you could call a cartel, that as the club that is a cartel of creditors could negotiate on larger terms. It's always been an issue of keeping debtors divided and negotiating one by one with this menu of treatments. Well, what has happened today is that this non-system for debt restructuring is now bumping into two problems. The first one is that the Paris Club, that with all with all that we can say that's negative about it, was a place where debt was discussed. Now it no longer holds authority on the whole or on a large share of debts, but also now we have a large amount of private debts that are out of the Paris Club authority, of course, but that do not apply where the old idea of comparability of treatment and the gentleman's agreement between banks and governments doesn't apply either. So we have this other large problem, and that's why we are discussing today as civil society actors, and I would say other political actors are also doing so, what and how to deal with this whole problem. We have fantastic proposals, but that's I think it's a different chapter of these sessions, and you'll have plenty of content on that, on how to deal with this debt restructuring system that is a non-existing body today, and we need it to be in place if we want to solve problems tomorrow. And just to finish this session, I will just insist in some of the main messages Remi had introduced. I've been kind of insisting in, and it's the Paris Club. It's still very powerful. It still seats a wide number of countries, and even if they are a small number of, or they account for a small amount of the existing debts today, they still hold a great influence in the whole system, because they still play a leading role in the board of the IMF, and there's this connection because they have an operating system with its rules, and that's more than others have to deal with debt relief, and they are trying to adapt to make sure that they kind of run this new body, or again, non-system that has been created and that is under testing, and that's called the Common Framework that was announced by the G20 last year. And that's my last point. I was saying that in the past it was the G7, the Paris Club, and the IMF that were somehow running the show on how things were going to be done. I think we could say that today it's still the IMF central role. The G7 has shifted to the G20, so now we have this different body that's more diverse and that has a larger membership, and that it includes the largest creditors such as China in the driving seat of that triangle. But then we have the Paris Club that is shifting to this new other thing or institution or whatever called the Common Framework. And again, we are missing an integrated system where governments, debtors, and creditors, all of them, would be sitting together with private institutions and private funds, and with multilateral institutions to reach agreements on debt needs and debt troubles at a larger scale. We are not there, and I think it's important to move in that direction. But for all of you to know, the Paris Club has a long history, and it's still here, and it can still be influential. So we need to pay attention, and we need to keep pushing, as Remi and other colleagues are leading us on doing, for transparency and for increased action. I think I'll leave it here, Muchimba, and thanks very much, everyone, for your attention, and happy to engage in questions and dialogue.
Great. Thank you so much, Jaime, for that very insightful presentation, as well as the presentation that came from Remi. And really, this is around debt relief and the Paris Club historical perspective. Coming from a civil society myself, I think the whole discussion of debt relief is really with the aim of trying to finance development for developing countries, for developed countries, especially in the era of COVID-19. So with the two presentations that were made, we have looked at the Paris Club, what it is, when it was formed. It is an informal body. And I think, Jaime, you have emphasized the influence that such a club still has. For example, insisting that debtor countries should be on IMF programs if really benefits should translate to those economies. So we do have a number of questions, about 7 or so. So possibly we can handle them for the next 10 to 15 minutes. And the first question in our chat is coming from Louisa, and this is asking, do member countries in the Paris Club have equal veto power? And Jaime or Remi, please, at any point, if any one of you can tackle that question, that will be fine. The second question that you can take in this session is, if the DSSI is being used, that is the Debt Suspension Initiative, does it mean that the World Bank or IMF debt sustainability analysis is the tool used in presenting the country's financial state? If we could handle those two questions before we go on to the next questions.
I'm happy to answer, Remi, but you can go first if you want. Yep, shall I go? Okay, I'll start, and please correct me, Remi, if I don't get it right. So, do all countries have equal veto power in the Paris Club? So the Paris Club normally decides by consensus. So it's hard to know how this consensus is reached, but we have seen that normally decisions that have been, when the rules have been bent, we could say, mostly historically, we've seen a strong push by the United States. The example I gave, Egypt, Iraq, and some others, it was mostly a push that was kind of provoked or carried forward by the United States. Does this mean that they have a veto power or others have less power? No, it probably represents well that among the Western countries, that's the most powerful Western country, and the one that's more ready to, let's say, bend the informal rules to favor a certain political position. That would be my answer to that first question. But as I say, there's no actual veto power because there are no actual rules. So, and consensus is reached out, and there's no publicity of the discussion that happened behind closed doors. So that's I think the best approximation we can give to those to that question. And to the second one on the DSSI, yes, they are using the IMF debt sustainability assessment. This means that there's no attention being paid to the capacity of countries to comply with the Sustainable Development Goals, or to be able to pay for their health needs or their health and education needs. But what's being looked at are the macro analysis, the macro assessment, the track record of payments, the financial indicators that are related to debt that are very important. But that's just it. So yes, the IMF's DSA is being used as an indicator and as the most relevant indicator for countries under the DSSI, and I would say out of the DSSI when looking at their debt matters.
Thank you so much. Remi, you can go ahead with any additions.
Oui, simplement dire, je suis tout à fait d'accord avec ce que vient de répondre Jaime.
I totally agree with what Jaime just said about the first question. What is very fundamental to take into account is that if we keep on seeing the debt on economic point of view, we miss the political point of view. So in the practice, we are in a power relationship situations. So some of the countries are more powerful. We can see it with the United States, not only because they are the first economic power worldwide, but also because they are the first economic power, the first military power, so they can influence and blackmail other states in terms of debt restructuring. And at the end of the day, they can say that this decision is not favorable, so I would prefer to go that way. That's what can happen in the Paris Club. And the G7 precedes the decisions of the Paris Club, but China is not present in the G7. And some of the most powerful countries nowadays are the ones who take the big political and economic decisions in the world. And they are the ones who define the agendas for the upcoming years. So that's why it's so important to take into account the political aspect.
Thank you so much, Remi, for that response. And just to ride on the answer that you were giving, we have a question that is asking, is the Paris Club an instrument to dominate and subject the global north? Of course, in your previous answer, you do allude to the power relations that exist between these various entities. And if you could just give us an insight on whether the Paris Club does dominate and subject the global south. And in doing so, just to answer another question, we have one participant who is interested to learn the difference between concessional and non-concessional restructuring measures as they relate to the Paris Club. Remi or Jaime, I don't know who got the question.
D'accord. Simplement pour m'assurer, la première question, c'est celle de Tahir, c'est ça?
Just to make sure, the first question is Tahir's question with the 3 hypotheses. Is that one? I'm not sure.
Okay, sorry, maybe we could just stick to the questions as they came in. We have one question that wants to learn, is the Paris Club an instrument that dominates and subjects the global South? Perhaps, Remi, you could take that question.
Je dirais oui et non.
I would answer yes and no, or yes, in the sense that the global South is not represented in a great extent in the Paris Club, even if some countries like Brazil lately joined the Paris Club. Besides the politics and the conditionality linked to the restructuring of debt come from agreements made with the IMF. And this participates into strengthening the inequalities between North and South. But I would answer no, even if it's a little no. I think countries from the global South play the Paris Club game and would have the possibility to reject the conditions of the Paris Club for economic and political reasons in order to defend their own interests. And we see it's not an exception. We commonly see people as individualities acting for entire governments. But as to summarize, I would say that the Paris Club is a tool, a powerful tool, but the countries from the South could act, and we should go deeper into the political influences. The countries from the South do reinforce the power of the Paris Club members.
Thank you so much. Jaime, just to share a few questions from the chat. We did have one earlier from Andrew Kaufman, who is interested to understand the difference between concessional and non-concessional restructuring measures, especially as they relate to the Paris Club.
I can try to answer that. I'm not quite sure what you're referring to, because when you look at concessional and non-concessional debts, the thing is that the Paris Club will differentiate what are the nature of debts being treated. So it will provide a certain treatment for debts that come from ODA loans. These ones will receive a certain treatment, but those that come from non-concessional, and these are normally debts that come come to light after export credit operations that have become failed, and then there has to be it turns into a public-to-public debt. Those receive a different treatment, but there are differences in each of the terms of the Paris Club, and there's always more flexibility in terms of relief when it's about ODA related debts than when it is about non-ODA related debts. And then there's a difference also in how these operations are accounted for as ODA. That's a totally different picture, but we can go into that if you are interested. I can try to explain it in 1 minute. If you are canceling or providing relief to debts that come from an ODA grant, you would only be allowed to account as ODA the interest rates that were being part of the debt relief. If, on the contrary, you are providing a cancellation or similar, or even of a part of an non-concessional debt operation, the full amount, the principal and the interest cancelled would be accounted for as debt relief in the ODA of the year in that concrete donor country. I mean, this can be a little bit tricky. Maybe I don't want to push everyone in this direction, but I think that's my shortest answer to this question. I don't know if Remi wants to say something.
Okay, thank you so much for that feedback. What we could do, most of the questions could still be answered in the chat or through the Q&A pop-up box that we have. So we do encourage the participants to keep popping their questions right there. I think at this point in time, we've come to our first break. This is before we go into our second session. Our second session will be looking at the overview of debt in Africa, and hopefully some of the questions around the relief initiatives and how they can benefit the Global South will be handled by our next speaker. So we will go on break. My time is 4 p.m. and we will be back in 10 minutes at about 4:10 p.m. Thank you, everyone. This is our third Debt Wednesday session for anyone that is joining us. We're just coming in from the first half that was looking at debt relief and the Paris Club historic perspective. We will be moving on to the second session of today that is focusing on the overview of Africa. The Debt Wednesday is an initiative that is really trying to help each and every one of us understand debt in different various forms, and just to understand how dynamic the concept of debt is evolving. So our second speaker, third speaker in practice, or our speaker for this session, the overview of Africa, is Tirivangani Mutazu, coming to us from Afrodad, which is the African Development and Debt Network from the African region. As mentioned, he is a senior policy analyst. Tiri, welcome, and you have the floor to begin your presentation as soon as you are ready.
Okay, thank you very much, Muchimba, and good afternoon, colleagues and dear participants. I think I will be sharing some slides, so I will try to share my presentation. But maybe just as opening remarks, thank you very much, Afrodad and our colleagues for organizing these sessions. I think they are very important for our understanding of the debt situation currently. I think Africa as a region is well, in other words, well versed, or a number of countries have been to the Paris Club. They have had a lot of debt restructuring under the Paris Club for many years. I think almost half of the African countries have been to the Paris Club to restructure their debts. Some countries have gone there more than 11 times from some of the studies that have been done, and some of them they have been there even close to 20 times trying to restructure their debts. But what that means is that maybe the Paris Club hasn't been very effective and timely in restructuring African countries' debts. And that's one of the reasons why we have seen them going there more than 12 or 13 times trying to restructure their debts. We have a history of a lot of African countries having been to the IMF through the HIPIC and the MDRI debt relief mechanisms. That is from 1999 and 2005 when these release initiatives were muted by the IFIs. The debt history of Africa is full of debt restructuring, let me put it that way. I'm trying to share give me a minute, my presentation is, It has disappeared on me now. Okay. Okay. 1 minute, 1 more minute.
Thierry, if you want, I can share the presentation.
Okay, let me try once again. 1 minute.
Okay, no problem.
Okay. I think sorry. Maybe you can try. Sorry, I don't know what's going on with my machine here. Please go ahead and share. Okay. Slideshow, maybe. So yes. So maybe in brief, I thought of maybe if I can give the data indicators with regards to sub-Saharan Africa. And I think this can help us in terms of the overview of the debt, especially how bad it is at the moment, or how bad it was before COVID or just before COVID. I think the indicators were so worsening, and they were painting a picture that shows that the debt in the region was not going to be sustainable going forward. So we had 20 countries classified by the IMF in 2019 as being in external debt distress or already in high debt distress. So these 20 countries by 2019 were considered already to be in debt distress, and some of them were in high debt distress. This is before COVID. Some sources actually estimate that the external debt for Africa, especially from the AU, African Union, is estimated to be around 236 billion as of last year, which is 2020. The debt to GDP ratio on average in 2019, it was around 58%, which the IMF said went close to 64% last year, which is 2020. As you are aware that a number of sub-Saharan African countries have gone back to the IMF, and some analysts are actually saying that they are being kept solvent through the IMF programs. We have quite a number of African countries, especially those that benefited from the HIPC and the MDRIs. We have your Ghana, you have your Zambia, you have your Senegal. All of them, they've gone back to the IMF for programs or for financial help. Zambia already has defaulted on some of its debts, and this is mainly cited as the reason being the rising bond yields or the interest rates, and Zambia already is considered to have defaulted. We are also seeing a rise with regards to debt to revenue ratios, where debt service is actually crowding out investments and social spending in most of our countries. And this is one indicator where a number of African countries have actually failed to contain. There are countries already that are spending more than 60% of their annual revenue servicing their debts. Yeah, next slide. Yes, so with regards to the class debt sustainability assessment done in 2019, some of those countries were already in debt distress. I think they are Mozambique, you have my Zimbabwe there, you have South Sudan, Sudan, Somalia, and Sao Tome. As you are aware that Sudan and Somalia, they have been included in the HIPC initiative now, and they are in a program where their debts are going to be restructured, or they are being restructured under the HIPC initiative. And somehow this is where the Paris Club also have played a bigger role, and the other bilateral donors. as I said, there are other countries who are maybe not doing badly on other indicators, but with regard to debt service ratios, I think we have countries that are really doing badly on that. Here we have Kenya, Malawi, and Uganda, where we have seen that their debt service levels or ratios are really very high. And this is an area, especially for us from civil society organization, where we are very much concerned, because once a country pays more than 60% of its debt service, its annual budget on debt service, that really becomes a big challenge. And one of those countries is actually Angola. Angola is cited as a country where the government is spending more on debt service than on other sectors. Yeah, next slide. Sorry. I think my colleagues previously alluded to this fact that the debt landscape, especially within the region, have actually changed over the last decade. We have seen new kids on the block with regards to the creditors, and the nature of the debt have actually changed. It's moving more into non-concessional and private debt and commercial debt. A lot of these countries are going on the international capital markets, raising euro bonds. And this is a debt which is really risky given the economic landscape of the region. And currently, the large share of the African debt is being held by private banks and bondholders. Cited that some sources, they say that close to 31% of Africa's debt now is being held by private lenders. The Paris Club has been alluded to, although it is still very influential, but it's losing its grip because with regards to Africa, it only has around 5% of the continent's debts. So we have China, which is a bilateral creditor, holding close to 20% of the Africa debt. And I think these two types of credits, the private creditors in China, are really giving major challenges to a lot of sub-Saharan African countries when it comes to debt restructuring. I think I'll try to show this in some of the slides upcoming. Next slide. Here, I think as of last year, using the data from the IMF, September 2020, we tried to classify the African countries in terms of the debt risk map. So you see that the countries in red are already classified as already in debt distress, actually. They have huge challenges with their debts. The yellow ones are those with high risk of falling into a debt distress. The light green, the moderate, and the thick green is the low risk. So this was as of September 2020, and I think due to COVID-19, you will see that a map being provided by the UK is painted more red with regard to the region. Next slide. Yes, this I took from Jubilee debt, where you will see that the African region there is more red than the map I provided before. What it means is that we have more countries now that are actually in debt distress. And a lot of them, they are at risk with the private debts, which, as we have had in the last two presentations, especially the challenge of the private creditors. We have seen them not participating in the current debt relief mechanisms that are in place. There are still efforts to make sure that they participate, but maybe not yet. The DSSI and also the G20 framework, I think it's important that they be part of the creditors that are within those frameworks, so that the region also, or the countries within the region, will have better deals with regards to debt restructuring. As I said, the larger share of their debt currently is towards the private debt. Next slide. I think my colleagues touched on this. I think the issue of Africa's debt restructuring falls in almost all these categories, so I wouldn't want to spend much time on them. But the history where we are coming from as a region has been actually dominated by the HIPC and the MDRI. And a lot of countries actually benefited, close to 30 plus African countries benefited from those debt relief initiatives. But we know that these have already expired or they are expiring, and any new debt challenges would not see these, the HIPC and MDRI coming into play again. So it's very important that a new mechanism, I think a new mechanism which is better than this before, be put in place. Yes, next slide. Yes, I think currently with regards to what is currently called the new Africa's new indebtedness, there are so many reasons why this is the case. And here we have what they call the internal and external factors. I think in the history of Africa's debt, I think you will see that the past debts in the 1980s and the 1990s had a mix of reasons why Africa went into a debt challenges or debt crisis. Equally, there were internal and external factors, yes. But currently, again, the new type of debt we are seeing, the new indebtedness within Africa is also a lot of internal and external factors. And some of the internal factors here refers to the growing fiscal deficits we are seeing in quite a number of our African countries' budgets. Year in, year out, they are registering deficits. We've also seen fluctuating international commodity prices. Still quite a number of African countries depend on commodity exports, and they don't have control over the prices of these commodities. Hence the ups and downs that we have seen with commodity prices, and they really affect the revenue inflows into a number of countries. There are also varying political and macroeconomic environments. For example, currently we are talking about COVID. It's a health crisis, the health pandemic, but it has huge macroeconomic impacts. We have seen poor governance, especially internally within a number of African countries, with regards to how the debt or the debt resources are being used or invested. There is very little return to end up servicing the debts when they mature. But there is also an internal capacity issue with regards to loan contraction. How should debts be contracted and managed, and from which sources should countries get their debts from? There's also been a decline in official development assistance, and I think we have seen this, and there's a shrinking space for concessional finance. I think currently, because of COVID-19, there has been a lot of push from the global CSOs to ensure that low-income countries and developing countries, and particularly those in Africa, they get concessional finance instead of new borrowings that we are seeing. That creates a lot of debts. There has been major losses in export revenue as a result of the fall in global demand. With export revenue declining sharply, resulting in deteriorating current account balances. We have seen erosion of foreign exchange reserves and heavy losses in trade tax revenue. These are some of the internal and external factors that have led to the rise in the debts that we have seen in quite a number of African countries in terms of the stocks. But also there has been decline in financial inflows, especially from FDI and also remittance. And this is also true in the current context of COVID-19. Next slide. Yes, so I think my colleagues also touched on this, and in the context of African debt, this is also a big issue, because as I said before, China now holds close to 20% of Africa's external debt, and this is actually accelerating, and it's adding up to the overall debt stock of quite a number of African countries. They do lend bilaterally. For example, they have the zero interest loans. They have also the Exim Bank loans. They are loans that are provided by Chinese companies and also the Chinese Development Bank. And as CSOs, I think in year out, and I think over the past decades or years, we have been raising the red flags with regards to the Chinese lending policies, which we feel are shrouded in non-disclosure clauses. There hasn't been much transparency in terms of the debt contraction done by our countries with China. So there's need for transparency there. We have also seen that the Chinese loans have primarily targeted infrastructure and extractive industry projects and programs. And these are mainly in transport. You have your roads, your ports, your railway and airports. You have the energy sector, the mining and the communication sectors. So these are sort of the major economic sectors where you find any Chinese loans or investments going to. And some of the loans have been in the form of what they call commodity-linked debt. And some of these, maybe in some of the discussion, they are called resource-based loans. So a country will surrender some of its resources in the event that it fails to service Chinese debts. And this is true in quite a number of our countries. We have had media stories on this. Some of them are true, some of them maybe there's need for further research to find out truly what's going on. And commodity-linked debt increases the risk of debt sustainability due to uncertainties characterizing commodity prices in global markets. And I think they are badly negotiated in the context of Africa, these types of debts, that is resource-based loans. There is need for the authorities in different African countries to actually have a grasp and technical expertise on how best they can go about resource-based loans. At least 1/3 of Chinese loans have been secured by export commodities in borrower countries and also tied to Chinese goods and construction services. And this is mainly will result in governments assuming some of these private debts once the private companies, where the government will guarantee a private loan to private companies and the private company fails to pay off the debt and the government eventually will take charge of those loans. I think this is what we are also seeing in quite a number of African countries. But just to say that mainly the Chinese loans are also heavily concentrated in resource-rich countries. Obviously, you have Angola because of the oil, you have Ethiopia, you have Kenya, and Democratic Republic of Congo. Next slide. Yeah, this is just a figure showing the annual Chinese loan to African governments. And in 2016, that's sort of the highest, where we had almost 30 Chinese loans to African governments. And this has been declining since then. Next slide, and the source is the John Hopkins Institute. And here is just another figure showing Chinese lending by sector. And as I said, you have the power sector and the transport sector. That's where you find a lot of loans going into. And in almost all the African countries, you find Chinese infrastructure project being constructed by the Chinese. Yeah, next slide. So under COVID, I think in 2019, when COVID was declared a global pandemic, December 2019, getting 2021, we have seen quite a number of COVID-19 impacts, especially on debt sustainability in a number of African countries. Given the pre-COVID existing challenges, and this speaks to poor health infrastructure, that has less to pay to do with the pandemic. We had an informal economy and an economy and living condition which made it vulnerable, citizens vulnerable to the virus. We've seen lack of resources to respond to the economic impacts. So when COVID came, I think the continent or the region was not prepared with respect to these issues. The majority of the countries were unable to meet the essential health and humanitarian needs. So recovering economically becomes very difficult due to liquidity and fiscal constraints and growing debt service obligation. At the same time, the higher borrowing costs we are seeing. So to maintain debt sustainability, there is need for countries to access conventional financing, as I said before, especially currently to fund the vaccination and build sustainable health systems going forward. However, even before COVID, the international public finance has to play a very critical role. And by international public finance, basically we are referring to grant finance, international development assistance, replenishment. This is the IDA. We have blended finance. We have national and regional banks and international financial institutions. I think in the COVID era, we have seen them coming on board, with different instruments in trying to help low-income countries fight COVID-19 and its economic impacts. Next slide. Yes, so again, COVID-19 is, when it came, as I said, it exacerbated the pre-existing debt vulnerabilities and exposed the global financial architects. Already then, a number of African countries were already classified as in debt distress or high risk of debt distress. We are aware that the physical space for quite a number of African countries were affected. And we have seen commodity prices falling, the remittance going down, tourism almost zero, and countries, and these are sectors or revenue streams that bring in a lot of dollars, so to speak, forex, in order for countries then to service their debts. But due to COVID-19, we have seen dwindling in terms of revenue inflow from these sources. So debt becomes very unsustainable going forward. So we have also seen that, according to the World Bank, they're saying between February and April of last year, more than 100 billion in financial capital flowed out of the emerging and frontier markets. And this is also true with regard to quite a number of middle-income countries in sub-Saharan Africa. The World Bank again projected that remittance fell by close to 100 billion in last year. Maybe this is globally. The world global trade also fell. Debt distress effects, I think there are health issues, food security issues, unemployment and poverty issues. And I think all these are some of the impacts brought by COVID-19, especially on debt sustainability. Next slide. Yeah, so the international community, having realized that there has been collapse in GDP, collapse in budget revenue and foreign exchange earnings, the debt situation obviously was going to worsen for quite a number of low-income countries. So countries should not be placed in an untenable choice between maintaining social and health spending to combat COVID-19 or staying current on debt payments. So on the political front then, we saw the African heads of states and finance ministers in African Union panel and us global debt CSOs calling for debt relief. And we saw that then the international community, especially the IMF and the G20, they then came up with the DSSI and the G20 common framework currently talked about. But also the IMF itself, it came up with close to 10 billion given to low-income countries from its different sources. We have the RFI, that's the Rapid Financing Instrument, you have the PRGT and also the CCRT. I think a lot of close to 20 African countries have actually accessed some of these instruments. The World Bank, again, and the African Development Bank, they also came on board with some initiatives to help low-income countries. Next slide. And I think the current debt relief initiative we have seen post-COVID, as my colleagues alluded to, they are generally on the debt service suspension initiative, which we know now has been extended to end of December 2021. And this is in agreement with the G20, the Paris Club that have been talked about, although it has less influence now, and also the IFIs. They've come up with the DSSI, basically to enable countries to fund pandemic-related expenditures. Regardless the fact that as CSOs, we've raised a lot of issues with the DSSI. One of the major ones is that the non-participation of the private creditors, and also it's voluntary. Some countries are excluded, and I think these are key concerns on the DSSI. Lack of participation of private creditors. Without their participation, public resources are likely to be used to bail out private creditors rather than for recovery and development. And I think the current global efforts to make sure that the private creditors do take part in the DSSI should be supported, because in the context of Africa, we've seen that the nature of the debt is actually shifting towards private sector. The G20 Common Framework, which is an initiative on board now, they say it aims to facilitate timely and orderly debt treatment for DSSI eligible countries with broader participation of creditors, including the private sector. I think as the details around it are discussed and maybe become more public, I think we would still be concerned about the lack of details around the framework, especially for us CSOs. But however, we have seen a number of African countries lining up for eligibility, or they want their debt to be treated under the G20 Common Framework, and this is Chad, Zambia, and Ethiopia, and Senegal. And again, like the Paris Club, I think it's a case-by-case basis. Countries have to go and explain themselves to the cartel, the creditor cartel, in my view, of which is being supported by the major creditors. But I think the fundamental challenges that we have been raising as global CSOs around debt restructuring still comes into play, because we're still not seeing a debt restructuring mechanism that is fair and transparent, that treats the debtor and the creditor as equals, and that also looks at other development needs of debtor countries, such as the need to achieve SDGs. So we still have challenges with regards to, especially the current debt relief initiatives we are seeing. Next slide. Yes, so any new debt restructuring, in my view, should address the systematic debt vulnerabilities, especially of low-income countries or debtor countries. We've talked about debt transparency, not only with the Chinese type of debts, but also even with the other bilaterals, even with the private sector. It is very important that there be transparency and responsible lending and borrowing, especially with private creditors' involvement. I think this is one of the challenge we would want to see. Again, we have new holdouts and litigation tactics by private bondholders who resist large debt write-downs and restructuring. we have seen this before the COVID itself. So this needs to be tackled at the international level. We have seen countries, for example, in the UK and Brussels, they've enacted laws to prevent that. But domestically, I think within the data countries, we have also seen efforts with regards to the collective action clauses being included in the loan contracts or the bond contracts that a number of African countries currently are entering into. I think these, in a way, in one way or the other, will actually help data countries when it comes to restructuring, especially the private debts. Next slide. Yes, I think currently as Afrodad, I think in the last weeks, if not months, we have been pushing together with our global partners the issue to do the IMF special drawing rights. I think a lot of colleagues or participants are aware that currently the IMF and the G20 have agreed to issue special drawing rights worth around 650 billion to address liquidity needs of developing countries. We've heard that India has been resisting the proposal, but I think it's one way the international community, especially through the IMF, can help low-income countries address some of the challenges brought by COVID-19. There are technical aspects of the special drawing rights, but we really feel that maybe the important point for us has been the amount with regards to the allocation. I think globally, so we've been calling for a larger allocation, close to 3 trillion. And I know there are still demands trying to push for this type of allocation, amount of allocation, because the challenges or the development needs brought by COVID-19 are equally huge. Hence, the response should also be huge. Next slide. Yeah, maybe in conclusion, I would say that overall the debt environment within the region is worrying, especially when you look at different debt indicators, and also the bad economic landscape or situation we are seeing as a result of COVID-19. The chances of quick recovery are slow. And the continent needs some maybe internal mechanisms, especially with regard to domestic resource mobilization, which is very crucial. When you look at the 2015 Addis Ababa Finance for Development Conference, I think DRM was one of those big issues under discussion where low-income countries were urged to actually use domestic resources for development. The IMF would say that currently you see that the current tax to GDP ratio within the continent is around 17%. But when you look at the OECD countries, well above 30%. I think there's need to improve on that as the region. No country can sustainably depend on external resources for its own development. And as such, it is very important that our countries really look at the fact that their national budgets are really funded by domestic resources. There are other instruments that are being used, for example, with the public-private partnerships. I think these are key for Africa's quest for infrastructure. To close the infrastructure gap, currently that is very huge. They can use private partnership, private-public partnerships. If well negotiated, I think these can deliver the results, but there's a mix of results within the continent with regards to private-public partnerships. Some have failed, some have delivered services that are now beyond the ordinary citizens. But also strongly is the need for the continent to better manage the economies. I think there's no discussion with regards to the need for a strong macroeconomic fundamentals to be in place in most of our countries. I think these are internal issues that really need attention of our authorities. But also at the international level, the issues we always talk about, the curbing of illicit financial flows, corruption, tax evasion, especially by multinational corporations in the extractive sector. Because the extractive sector is the only sector that has a potential to deliver the more than 17% tax to GDP ratio for most of our countries within the region. Last slide. Yeah, so again, in the spirit of moving forward, I think there are quite a number of measures that a number of our countries need to put in place. The issue of austerity measures, because I think from a civil society perspective, we have seen quite a wasteful expenditures with regards to our governments at the national level. And we would want that to be reduced, and hence the reduction in budget deficits. We've also seen the appetite to borrow. There's a lot of new borrowing going on at the national level, whether it's loans from China, international capital markets. I think the most important thing is then how are those resources being invested? I think productive investment becomes very key. But we have reached sometimes a point where we would ask ourselves as CSO, do we need to urge our government to scale down on infrastructure projects? Because we have seen this as one of the drivers of the appetite to borrow by our own governments. There are also issues around transparency and accountability within quite a number of African debtor countries, not only those already in debt distress, but across the board, whether it's low risk, the issues to do with transparency and accountability in debt management, I think it's very important in our fight as CSOs. Yeah, I think let me end here and say that the success of the region in managing the debt, I think is very important and is something that can be achieved through national and international efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Thierry, for that robust overview of really the debt situation in Africa. I know you've touched on where we are coming from, initiatives such as the HIPIC, the role that China has had to play, and you have actually also contextualized the impact of COVID-19, even in the debt discourse. We will move on to our Q&A session. Of course, we do have a few more minutes for our webinar, and we have about 3 questions, Thierry, that you can just shed more light on. So we have our first question from Louisa, and this question is talking about having heard about these creditor groups and these various cartels that do exist. What avenues or what groups are available for debtor countries to come together and advocate for their interests as a bloc? Possibly you could take that one on.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the debt issue is I think as my colleagues before have said, it's largely political, and it's a power relation game. So you have the debtor who is always the weaker side, and the creditor always from the powerful sort of side. And the issue of the debt situation within the continent has always been the blame game, that the failure or getting into debt crisis or challenges is always the problem of the debtor countries. And this sometimes has not been very true. I think largely we have had so many causes and reasons why low-income countries, especially in Africa, have ended up in debt crises, sometimes of not of their making. But as we have seen with the Paris Club, there's no history of debtor country cartels when it comes to the debt issue so far. Currently, as I said in my slide, we have had the African Union through the leadership of the chair, that is the then South African president and the Senegalese president, speaking on behalf of the African countries as a need for the international community to look at the debt issue of a lot of African countries because of COVID-19. I think that's in as far as I have seen the coming together of the different data countries within the continent speaking with one voice on the debt issue. But as my colleagues have said, and as I've said before, that we have seen African data countries treated on a case-by-case basis, countries going to the Paris Club more than 20 times, 15 times to reschedule their debts. But really, we've seen them going there as a group. And I know a lot of African civil society organizations and our colleagues from the global CSOs working on debt have been demanding that maybe it's high time the data countries form a cartel and demand a better debt restructuring mechanism from the international community. We have seen some discussion at the UN level when they came up in 2015, 2016 with some of the principles that should guide debt restructuring. But we've also seen the politics within the UN against that and how the data countries and the creditor countries then voted for those principles. But there's still a long way to go for us to see a data countries cartel. Yeah, I think that's as far as I can say. It's something that we need to push for as CSOs maybe.
Indeed, that is true, Thierry. And just to take one question, under a minute, we have a participant that is interested in learning more. For instance, where countries such as the United States, the G7 powers have significant economic interests, should that then translate into those debtor countries receiving easier conditionality? Perhaps just to tie this to the previous engagement on the Paris Club and its principles and really how it plays out. In your opinion, do you think that is something that should be considered?
Okay, from the question, what countries where the US and the G7 are significant economic interest should receive conditionality? What is your say on this question? I think that's the politics we have been as CSO talking about, and I think Jaime touched on this when he gave us examples of Egypt and Iraq. It's very clear that the debt issues, when it comes to restructuring, sometimes there are other considerations to do with economic interest. You have also seen what has happened with Sudan. Currently, all of a sudden, it gets a bridge loan to clear its arrears and get into HIPIC, the same with Somalia. I think it is very true that the US and the G7, when it comes to data countries where they have economic interest or political interest, they don't apply the same rules to the other countries where they might not have the same interests.
Thank you so much, Thierry, for that feedback. I wish we did have more time to handle the other questions that did come in, but I do hope someone in the background will be able to provide some feedback and some response. And really, for everyone that joined the webinar today, we have been looking at the concept of debt relief, the historical perspective of the Paris Club, and the overview of debt in Africa. And this is really just to thank all participants for joining this webinar. I hope it has been very insightful, as it has been for myself. And at this point, would also just like to thank the speakers who have also ably answered all the questions in the Q&A box, and anyone else from the technical side, the technical team. To the interpreters, thank you so much for having ably done the job. I think I did benefit from the English interpretation during Remi's presentation that was done in French. Once again, would also like to thank the donors, and these are European Union, the Bread for World, the Open Society Foundations, as well as Avina Americas. And this is just a reminder to everybody, we will have our next webinar session, and this will be on the 12th of May. And this will be around the concept of illegitimate debt and debt audits, and we'll also present an overview of debt in Asia, just as we did today for the African scenario. And also, just as a news item, for the next event, we will have interpretation in Portuguese as well. So please widely share the event once it has been shared through the various networks or the Eurodad website, as we continue to really understand the key concepts around debt itself, around sovereign debt and how it's affecting different nations. And really, I hope moving forward in our own ways, each and every person can really just find a way that they can influence different policy initiatives as a call to humanity, in the spirit of fostering equality and equity across the globe. I think one thing for myself that COVID-19 has taught us is really this is a global connected world. You may not be directly affected by the concept of debt, but one way or the other, it should be an issue that we tackle as a collective. As a matter of logistics, this webinar will be available and recorded onto the YouTube channel. Ilaria, perhaps you could share when people can expect to receive presentations as well as the recorded webinar.
Yeah, thank you very much, Muchimba, for the remarks. Usually we will upload all the recordings on Eurodad's YouTube channel 2 weeks after the event. So you can expect this more or less the week before next event, which is going to be on May 12th.
Thank you so much, Ilaria. Once again, thank you all, and until next time. Thanks.
Goodbye, thank you.